camp already established. A few years after this time, buildings were erected for the purpose of killing people with poison gas. Due to the planned volume, crematories were also built to burn the bodies. Before enduring what is known as the final solution, historians estimate that more than 1.5 million people were murdered at this location. Not all, but the majority, because they practiced a particular religion known as Judaism. International Holocaust Remembrance Day commemorates the liberation of Auschwitz by the Red Army. Upon their arrival, January 27, 1945, the Russian soldiers found 7,000 people who were imprisoned in deplorable conditions, suffering from starvation and exhaustion. These people, perceived as of no value, were abandoned by the Germans as they could no longer work, and marching to the next camp was impossible in their emaciated condition. In addition to piles of prosthetic limbs, eyeglasses, and suitcases, more than 600 bodies were also found. Some had died, some had been shot. Historians and survivors say that prior to leaving, the Germans ordered the prisoners to blow up buildings and destroy documents evincing their crimes. Please keep in mind that at this point in the war, the Allied forces were closing in on Hitler and the Germans were on the run, moving prisoners who could still work from camps throughout Poland into Germany, all the while attempting to destroy evidence of their crimes. 76 years ago today, my dad was walking with 6,000 to 10,000 other prisoners. It was day 6 of a 12-day march out of the forced labor camp, Blechhammer, a sub-camp of Auschwitz. This march was a total of 118 miles. The temperatures were freezing. There was more than likely snow on the ground some or all of the days that they walked, 10 to 12 hours per day in clunky wooden shoes. They slept a few hours per night in barns along the way or just outside on the ground. There was no warm clothing, boots, or coats provided. Prisoners were given some bread, a small portion of margarine, and artificial honey as food for the trip. My dad and other survivors have described this march and how people were shot if they could no longer walk. My dad somehow made it to the next destination, Gross Rosen, and remained there for 5 days. From Gross Rosen, he was then transported by train in an open coal car to Buchenwald, where he remained until 1945, when he was liberated at the age of 14. At that time, my dad spoke Polish, Yiddish, and a little German. When the tanks and soldiers appeared on a rainy day in April, speaking English, my dad did not know what they were saying. U.S. Army Sergeant Israel Friedman from Brooklyn told my dad in Yiddish that he was free. I found his son Rich in remote Washington State a few years ago. Rich and I will meet on Zoom in April to share our father's respective stories about Buchenwald and liberation. Also in this presentation, I will share a remarkable story validating my dad's presence in Buchenwald. I need a little drink here, sorry. So the way the webinar works, we could do one slideshow, and Jeff is doing the slideshow, and I put my visuals in the PDF that was distributed. So unfortunately, you're stuck with me a few more minutes here. Okay, let me go back a few years to Będzin, Poland, where my father was born, and both sides of his family lived dating back to the early 1700s. I now know this information from records that I received from Jewish Records Indexing Poland. From these documents, I discovered the names of 2 faceless generations of family members who were in forced labor camps or were killed during the Holocaust. In the program brochure, I provided some history of the invasion, occupation, ghettoization, and deportation of the people who lived in Benjamin. Growing up as a young boy, my dad would regularly walk with his mom to the market when they would usually stop along the way and visit with relatives or friends. In addition to being a busy mom, my grandmother Hannah also worked outside the home doing sewing or cleaning. My dad described in his book, Silent for 60 Years, the day the Germans came to their family apartment at 77 Modriavska. Their dog Rex was barking at the German soldiers. One of them turned his waving pistol and shot Rex in the head. His blood poured onto the floor as my dad and family stood in disbelief. They were then taken into the courtyard along with the other residents of the building, where the Germans were separating them into groups. My dad and his father were placed in a group with other men. My mom and his 3 siblings were moved across the courtyard with other women who had children. After this sorting exercise was completed, my dad watched his mom and 3 siblings being loaded onto a truck, which when full, drove away. That was the last time he saw them. My dad and his father were placed on another truck and then taken to a work camp. Beginning in the spring of 1942 through August that year, the Germans deported 8,000 to 10,000 people from Benjamin to Auschwitz. Based on the date of my Uncle Chaim's birth in mid-1942, more than likely my grandmother Hannah and her 3 other children were deported in August. It is possible and likely they may have been in the large group of residents that was taken to the soccer field as part of the deportation organized by the Germans. I've shared a drawing made by a Holocaust survivor in the program brochure where he documented this event. After several days in the warm August weather without food, water, or adequate facilities, they were marched through town to the train station and then packed into rail cars to travel to Auschwitz, which is just 27 miles south of Benjamin. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, they were taken to the shower building and killed with poison gas delivered through the system that had been designed and installed specifically for these purposes. I have read the testimony of prisoners who were charged with removing the intertwined bodies, which could result from this type of death. The image of my grandmother Hannah holding her baby and a child on each leg, gasping for air, haunts me. Hannah was 30. My Aunt Rosie was 6. Uncle Meyer was 10. And Chaim was a week old. When they were killed because they were Jewish. Before this terrible day, the Germans' intended plans had become known around town. It appears that my grandmother Hannah was afraid of what she had already seen and what could possibly happen. Last year, I saw a post in a second generation group on social media that referred to the Ładoś Group. I had no information or background on what this was. In reading the post, it spoke about the efforts of this group who helped people escape deportation from Benjamin and other cities with forged passports. A list of several thousand people who sought assistance was attached. Thankfully, it was in English and in alphabetical order. First, I scrolled to the F's. No Fainer families were listed, although I did see the name Furstenfeld, which was Hannah's mom's maiden name. I then scrolled to the letter U. My heart stopped when I saw my grandmother's name, Hannah Ida Ehrman, born 1912. unspecified document. It said, she was the only Ermine listed. Now, while her mom's name, my grandmother's mother's name was also Hannah Ermine, and she had aunts by this name as well, she was the only one born in 1912. I was overwhelmed with emotions of amazement and sadness to discover my grandmother Hannah had written for help. I included in the program brochure the page with Hannah's name and the notes from the Silverstein archives in Yad Vashem. I planned to write to possibly locate the letter that she had written. I cannot fathom the adversity and horror that my grandmother faced. The ray of hope that she must have felt to know that there were people that did not remain indifferent to their tragedy and who were willing to help is hard to put into words. I have read that the cost associated with obtaining a forged passport ranged from 500 to 2,000 francs, and this amount did not include the cost of any bribes that may have been needed to get letters from one person to another. During these times, I don't believe that my father's family had the resources to buy one, never mind 6 passports. Maybe there was a benefactor, maybe there was not. When the response to her letter was sent to Benjamin, Hannah was not found, as the letter was delivered after she had already faced the final solution. I'm unsure how my dad would have reacted to discovering this information, although he would not be surprised that his wonderful mother did everything in her power to attempt to save her family. I saw in another social media post that the people responsible for publishing the Ładoś list were coming to New York City. Since it is just a short train ride away from me, I felt compelled to go and learn more. I met several people responsible for bringing these remarkable efforts to light, including Ambassador Kumasz and the co-author Monika Maniewska, who is with us today from Poland. Monika signed the copy of the book, The Ładoś List, that I received from my grandmother, Hannah. I hope I have that lined up right. I've learned a great deal about Benjamin and the Holocaust from my co-presenter. I would now like to introduce my friend Jeff Cymbler to tell you about the Ładoś Group and how their remarkable activities came to be known.
I think I'm on, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I think I'm ready to go if this is working correct. The story of the Ładoś Group's activities to rescue Jews throughout German-occupied Europe has only been pieced together in the past few years. Yet I've known about these Latin American passports for over 30 years. I found copies of over 200 such passports in the archives of Yad Vashem in Jerusalem in the 1980s. Yet neither I, as a researcher, nor, more importantly, any of those who were saved by those passports had any idea that the passports were either forged or unauthorized by the countries whose seals those passports bore. And no one, until a couple of years ago, knew who actually the forgers were.
Jeff, do you want to go ahead and press play?
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you.
No.
Okay. So that was the cover. In recognition of the historic work that the Ładoś Group did during World War II, only about 4 days ago, Polish Parliament voted to declare this year the year of the Ładoś Group in Poland. During the Second World War, an unofficial group of Polish diplomats from the Polish legation in Bern led by that country's envoy to Switzerland, Alexander Ładoś, cooperated with representatives of Jewish organizations to rescue Europe's Jews. From at least the beginning of 1941 until the end of 1943, the members illegally purchased and issued passports and citizenship certificates of 4 South and Central American states: Paraguay, Honduras, Haiti, and Peru. These were delivered to people under threat of death in the Holocaust and served to protect their bearers from transport to the death camps located in the Third Reich. Various estimates show that the Ładoś Group issued 4,000 to 5,000 of these documents during the passport campaign, which could have reached as many as 10,000 people. This book, The Ładoś List, which was published a little over a year ago, is the first attempt to create a list of all people for whom the documents were created. The list currently includes 3,253 individuals, some of whom survived the war, some of whom perished in the Holocaust, and many of whom whose fates remain unknown. Research on the list was conducted by the Polish Embassy in Bern in cooperation with Pilecki Institute in Warsaw and the support of other institutions such as the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, the Institute of National Remembrance, the Museum of Auschwitz-Birkenau, Jewish Roots, Jewish Records Poland Indexing, and my own society, the Benjamin Sosnowiec Area Research Society. From at least the beginning of 1941 until the end of 1943, a group of Polish diplomats led by Alexander Ładoś, the Polish envoy to Bern, engaged in a remarkable venture. Cooperating with at least 2 Jewish organizations, the World Jewish Congress and Agudas Yisrael, the group illegally purchased and issued passports and citizenship certificates for 4 South American and Central American countries: Paraguay, Honduras, Haiti, and Peru. They used these documents with the intention of saving the lives of Jews during the Holocaust. Initially, the passports and certificates were sent exclusively into the German-occupied Poland to rescue Polish Jews. However, they became later the tool for rescue operation, which expanded to include the Netherlands, many other countries, and also to include German and Austrian Jews who had been stripped of their German citizenship. The documents significantly increased the bearers' chances of surviving the war, as they declared them to be, quote, foreigners. As such, those individuals would be included on lists of Jews marked for prisoner exchange or transported as inmates to transit camps instead of extermination camps. The key to the success of the entire operation was the support of the Polish envoy, Alexander Ładoś. Ładoś played the central role in the passport campaign, authorizing and overseeing the work of his diplomats and surrounding his subordinates with complete diplomatic and political support, which included intervention and coming to their defense when the operation was discovered by the Swiss authorities. Thanks to his determination, Swiss officers suspended their investigation into the Polish and Jewish participants in the campaign in the fall of 1943. At the end of that year, Ładoś began to intervene diplomatically, after which the Polish government in exile was able to convince Paraguay to temporarily recognize the forged passports. As the head of the legation, Ładoś put himself and his diplomats at the disposal of his Jewish partners and gave them political protection. In addition, Ładoś led a significant part of the work, along with at least 3 other Polish diplomats. Together, they began an effective diplomatic campaign to have the documents recognized by the authorities in whose names the documents had been issued. Witnesses at the time offered recalled that the operation would not have been successful without Ładoś's support. And indeed, he was referred to by at least one of the Jewish members of the rescue operation, by Chaim Eiss, one of the founders of Agudas Yisrael, as righteous among nations. I've highlighted this letter dated October 7, 1943, that was written by Chaim Eiss to Julius Kuhl, who was a Jewish diplomat and in the legation at the time. And the words in Hebrew referring to the minister, Polish minister in Bern, says, Chasidei Umat Olam, righteous among the nations. Alongside Ładoś himself, the group included the deputy head of the legation, Stefan Ryniewicz. Ryniewicz was the deputy head of the Polish legation in Bern, and simultaneously the formal head of the consular section. His duties included convincing the World Jewish Congress's Relief Committee for War-Stricken Jewish Population, referred to as RELICO, to become involved in the operation, arranging conditions conducive to its continuation, including keeping contact with the Jewish organizations, the consuls of the United States and the Latin American nations, and the remaining diplomatic corps in Berlin, and also with the federal authorities in Switzerland. The other member of the group was Vice Consul Konstanty Rokicki. Rokicki was the de facto head of the consular section of the Polish legation in Bern in the years 1939 to 45. He was engaged in the process of issuing forged Latin American passports from the operation's onset. From between 1941 and 43, he personally filled out over 1,000 Paraguayan passports by hand, entering the personal data of Jews residing in European nations under the German occupation. The information necessary for the documents to be issued was delivered to him by Abraham Zilberstein and Chaim Eiss, members of the Jewish organizations that were present in Switzerland, i.e. RELICO and the Agudas Yisrael. The fourth member of the Polish diplomatic corps in Bern was Dr. Julius Kuhl. Kuhl came from a Hasidic Jewish family in Poland. It was shortly after his employment at the Polish legation in Bern that he became the informal advisor on Jewish issues to the head of the legation, which was Alexander Ładoś. Kuhl played a significant role in maintaining strict cooperation between the legation and the Jewish diaspora in Switzerland, as well as in bribing the consuls of Latin American countries with accreditations in Bern and transporting the passports and certificates purchased from them. There were two non-diplomatic members of the Ładoś Group. They all were Polish and 3 of them were Jewish, but of the 2 members who were not members of the Polish diplomatic corps were Abraham Zilberstein. Zilberstein was the founder of the Committee for Relief of the War-Stricken Jewish Population, known as RELICO. As a known and influential personality, he was formerly a member of the lower house of the Polish parliament, as well as a very well-known lawyer in Lvov and a representative of the World Jewish Congress. He played an important role in gathering and passing data for the Latin American passports of the to the Polish diplomats and arranging the financial base for the whole operation. Finally, we come to Chaim Eiss. Chaim Eiss was one of the founders of the Orthodox Agudas Yisrael movement in 1912 and was its main representative in Switzerland during the Second World War. Like Abraham Zilberstein, ICE played an important role in both providing the Polish diplomats with personal data required to fill out the Latin American passports, as well as in securing the necessary funding. It is estimated that the list of names he recorded amounts to several thousand people who may have been included in the passport campaign. ICE died in Zurich in 1943. He was involved in the Polish legation's passport operation until the very final moments of his life. You see the photo of me visiting Chaim Ice's grave on the yard site on the 75th anniversary of his death. In addition to these 6 members that I mentioned, Ice, Kuhl, Ładoś, Rokicki, Reniewicz, and Zilberstein, there were other people who were prized. No other people, were apprised of the whole operation and informed of the roles played by the other members. Those outside this intimate circle often knew that there were Jewish organizations that were trying to arrange Latin American documents with the unspecified support of the Polish legation. Unfortunately, none of those members left behind any completed memoirs to clarify the process of forging. Broader circles of people knew that there was an operation going on, and we can refer to them as those being within the second circle. Those include people who worked for Zilberstein, including Alfred Schwarzbaum. And I'd like to focus on Schwarzbaum because of the connection to Sharon's father from being from Benjamin and my family being from Benjamin. Schwarzbaum lived in Benjamin before the war. He became an entrepreneur. He obtained a visa and left Poland in April 1940 and settled in Lausanne, Switzerland. Schwarzbaum soon began to send food, clothes, money, and papers to Poland. He was able to straddle the often uncoordinated Jewish and Zionist organizations located in Switzerland and obtained financial aid for Jews in German-occupied Poland. He sent hundreds of packages to places under German occupation via Portugal, Sweden, and Turkey. He corresponded with hundreds of Jews in the Benjamin and Sosnowiec ghettos. He also provided them with forged passports, which attracted the disapproving attention of the Swiss authorities, those who feared a violation of the country's neutrality. Another person to be remembered is Natan Eck. Eck was a member of the Zionist youth movement called the Gordonia, and in August 20th of 1942, during the major Warsaw Ghetto deportation, he escaped with his family to Częstochowa and then successfully crossed the border and reached Benjamin. In March 1943, Eck received a Paraguayan passport and wanted to leave Poland under the auspices of being a foreign citizen. He was then transferred by the German authorities to a POW camp in Tittmoning, Bavaria in Germany, and then to another POW camp in Vittel, France. From there, he was deported in May 1944 to Auschwitz. He escaped from the transport and made his way to Paris, where he lived in hiding until the end of the war. Eck was, in fact, one of the founders of the Yad Vashem Institute. Go back here. The tasks of Schwarzbaum and Eck and others like Natan Schwab included the distribution of passports in the ghettos and gathering of personal data for would-be recipients. These people can be referred to as Ładoś's second circle. They knew about the passports and who to approach in order to obtain them, but there is no evidence that they fully understood the mechanisms which led to their creation. There was a third circle of those who had certain knowledge about the operation, those who received, hid, and smuggled passports without knowing where they came from or how they had been prepared. This group includes several dozen Jewish and non-Jewish Swiss residents who are aware of the possibility of arranging documents for their friends and relatives and took the risk to acquire them and finance the operation. It was to their addresses that the passports were sent, and it was with their help that they reached the beneficiaries. And finally, the fourth circle. The fourth circle includes, of course, the passport recipients themselves, who had actively applied for a document and shared their limited knowledge of the procedure with their fellows. In May 1943, the Polish government was aware that in Bern, a large operation of forging passports and other documents was taking place and supported it out of purely humanitarian reasons. Alexander Ładoś was asked to send a list of the names of the recipients in order for effective intervention to be carried out so the governments of those countries could be persuaded to recognize their false citizens. Ładoś, likely mistrustful of the secret Polish ciphers, did not accede to the request for fear of the whole scheme being exposed. The only list, which was sent by Abraham Zilberstein in 1944, was an incomplete list. In researching the identities of the Belgian passport holders, an interesting phenomenon was discovered. We discovered many cases where false marriages were concluded in order to increase the number of Jews written on the document. Each passport included a person, his or her spouse, and their children, and sometimes other members of the family. Unmarried underground activists in the Belgian ghetto were encouraged to conclude fictitious marriages in order to save more of their contacts. One of those fictitious marriages was that of David Kozlowski and Heike Klinger. Heike Klinger became a major activist in the underground Jewish fighting organization in Belgium. She was chosen by her comrades to survive and to document their history to ensure the memory of their activities. Condemned to live, she fulfilled her obligation by writing her diaries in hiding in 1943 and escaping Europe during the Holocaust and arriving in Palestine. In her diary, Heike Klinger wrote as follows: "Then there was the passport affair. Letters from abroad with requests for photographs began to come. So what should be our stance on the issue of the internment camp? A council was called to decide, and a resolution was adopted against that idea. Later, we learned that Warsaw, meaning the underground movement in Warsaw, also adopted such a resolution. The resolution was adopted by all youth organizations. The reason that they opposed the passports was they felt it is their obligation to fight and revolt against the Germans." She continues, "But suddenly, after several weeks, we learned that some Gordonia members, other Zionist youth group members, had sent passport photographs. Papers began to come. There was a commotion in the town. The older generation was outraged at the young for their rejection of a chance to survive. Parents began to appeal to their daughters and sons, achieving partial success. And the young began to change their minds. Gordonia members openly supported the idea of sending the photographs. There was a frantic search for ways of doing that. The kibbutz Dror, another Zionist youth group in Benjin, was seething. Everybody was in favor of departure, and some asked, how come after so many years of underground activity, they had not received the passports, while others, like Ari Liver and Motek Sheshevo, had. By the way, those two members of the Gordonia survived by way of those passports. When the issue was discussed during a Hashoma HaSa'ir youth group meeting, everyone was in favor of fighting rebellion. Tzvi proposed a project suggested by Frumka to send everyone's photographs without their knowledge. We were against even that. And I don't know how Tzvi accepted the project at the yeshiva meeting at the Chechalutz. In the meantime, papers for Gordonia members began to arrive. Others were outraged and asked what were they going to be doing with the young. A number of passports for Gordonia were delivered, while we didn't get any, even for our group. When they already had about 20 passports, we finally got one. One that makes matters worse, a Honduran one, as you see on this photo. Not that that passport was any worse than the Paraguayan at all. All the passports were purchased from honorary consuls of Paraguay, Honduras, Haiti, and from the consul of Peru. By the way, none of those gentlemen were Latin Americans or South Americans. They were all well-to-do Swiss attorneys, part of the Swiss society, who just simply had those positions in Switzerland at the time. Almost all of the passport documents, constituting around half of the Ładoś passports, are Polish forgeries, filled in personally by Consul Konstanty Rokicki, and according to one account, also by Stefan Ryniewicz. On the other hand, the passports of Peru were probably the only type of document forged by the consul of that country. The Haitian documents were obtained probably thanks to Ładoś, who maintained close contact with the Haitian envoy to Bern. The remaining documents required for the Ładoś Group passport operation were obtained directly from the relevant consuls by Relko, Zilberstein's organization, the Jewish committee under his, which was part of the World Jewish Congress. This was undertaken with the complete support of the Polish government in exile and Ładoś. Zilberstein himself even referred to this support when he was arrested and interrogated by the police in Geneva in September 1943. The largest group of identified Ładoś passport bearers, accounting more than 1,226 people, comes from the cities of the Polish Zagłębie region, Benjin, Sosnowiec, Dąbrowa Górnicza, and other surrounding towns. These account for more than 1/3 of all of the identified people and more than 1/2 of all the Polish Jews on the Ładoś list. One explanation for this may be the exceptional organization of network under the control of Abraham Zilberstein, including that of Alfred Schwarzbaum, who was a Benjin native. In occupied Poland, possession of a Ładoś passport gave a person threatened by death during the Holocaust a significantly greater chance of survival. Polish Jews account for 42% of the identified survivors from all of Europe, but also 65% of all the identified victims, and as much as 91% of all holders of the Ładoś passports whose fate are still unknown. We are still researching what happened to them. It must be assumed, nevertheless, that the vast majority of the people on the Ładoś lists whose fates remain undetermined were in fact murdered during the Holocaust. The evidence also reveals a direct connection between the survival of many of the rescued Jews from the Netherlands and Germany and the Ładoś passports, thanks to which they avoided deportation to Auschwitz or Sobibor and were instead interned in Bergen-Belsen or exchanged for Germans in the hands of the Allies. In the case of Polish Jews, only a relatively limited number of examples of survival, thanks to the passports, are known. A group of families from the Belgian ghetto did actually wind up being interned in Tittmoning, a POW camp in Bavaria, and survived the war that way. In the case of some of the survivors, it must be assumed that the Ładoś documents played an important but secondary role. They represented a sort of spare lifeline, whereby their bearers' hopes of survival were increased. Some accounts include testimony that the passports were often kept as a last resort and used only during a selection or deportation. Among those saved in this way was Heinz Lichtenstern, who successfully convinced the SS officers in Theresienstadt that as a Paraguayan citizen, he should be excluded from transports to Auschwitz. This was recorded, his story, in his granddaughter's book entitled Tudi's Promise, prior to her ever finding out how that passport, which she had in her possession, was created. Nathan Garfinkel from Belgium likely had a similar aim in mind when he actually smuggled a Paraguayan passport into Auschwitz and then took it with him on a death march. The effectiveness of the Ładoś passports is not an assessment of the effectiveness of the group's activities, the task of which was simply limited to drawing up the documents. Both Ładoś and his subordinates and associates issued passports, sought the tolerance of the Swiss authorities and the favor of the diplomatic corps, all the while engaging in a struggle for the recognition of the documents. However, they could not have a direct impact on the fate of their bearers, which depended entirely on the group itself and the circumstances under which the individual bearers wound up. At least 16 passport bearers were killed in the Belgian ghetto. They include heroes of the Belgian ghetto uprising, such as Frumka Plotnicka and the Kozhik brothers. They also include my great aunt, Ruchel Cymbler. So how did the passport operation actually work? If we look at this chart, which tries to outline the flow, so to speak, Chaim Eiss and Abraham Zilberstein gathered the data about those in need of the passports in Poland and otherwise German-occupied Europe. They sent that information to the Polish legation in Bern. The Polish representatives purchased passports in blank from the various consulates, specifically Paraguay. The passports from Paraguay, the blank ones, are passed to the Polish representatives. Konstantin Rokicki fills out the documents and returns them to the consulate, where they are stamped by the consul and notarized. The documents are then passed on to the Jewish organizations via the Polish representatives, and then the Jewish organizations deliver the passports by mail to the Belgian ghetto, to their holders, and by mail to other parts of Europe. This is a colorized photograph. I mentioned my great-grandmother, my great-grand-aunt, being murdered in the Belgian ghetto. This is her, Rachel Cymbler, her husband, my grandfather's brother, Leon Cymbler, and their two children, Rachel and Deborah. In my research, many years ago at the Masua archives in Israel, I located a group of about 100 pages of letters that were written by Jews in the Benjamin ghetto to Alfred Schwarzbaum in Lausanne, Switzerland. Among those letters were 2 letters which were written by my grandfather's brother, Leon Cymbler. I was shocked that I found those 2 letters. One letter was dated January 1943, in which Leon sent Schwarzbaum photos of himself and his family and details of their birth dates, which were necessary for these passports, and was requesting that he send documents. This letter, which is dated March 23rd, 1943, was a follow-up letter that he wrote to Dr. Schwarzbaum. And I have the letter you see has this line across it. That is the German censor's pen. All the letters were censored by the Germans, and they used a special pen to look for invisible ink. There are 2 words that I underscored here in German, and they are schnell Antwort, meaning respond quickly. By March 23rd, 1943, Leon Cymbler recognized that time was of the essence to get these documents for him and his family. Unfortunately, they did not arrive in time. And to give you the chronology, what happened, the top left-hand side, you see a letter which is reproduced in the Benjamin Memorial Book, which was published by Benjamin survivors in Israel in 1959. This has a letter that was signed by Moses Meron, the gentleman on the bottom, who was the head of the Judenrat, the Jewish Council of all the cities in what was called Ober-Schlesien or Upper East Silesia, including Benjamin, and with its head office in Sosnowiec. And in June 2nd, 1943, Meron writes to Alfred Schwarzbaum stating, immediately, please stop all communications with Jews in my ghettos. It is known by other people who have written the history that Meron opposed the smuggling of these passports into these cities, these ghettos, to save the Jews. And indeed, in the same book, you find this list on the right, which is a list that was prepared by the Jewish Council, the Judenrat, which states on top that this is a list of Jews who, during the period of June 22nd to June 26th, 1943, were shot while attempting to escape a transport. And if you look down on the bottom, listed is my great aunt, Rachel Cymbler. As I've, over the last couple of years, been researching the story of the passports and also in general, communicating and interviewing survivors from Benjamin and Sosnowiec, I had the pleasure of visiting the home of this beautiful young woman who is in her early 90s today, only 2 years ago. And I came there to interview her about her Holocaust story. And when I got to her apartment, I saw on her wall framed a Paraguayan passport. A Paraguayan passport that I learned, as she wrote on this copy hanging in her apartment, the following. During the war, this passport was given out from the Paraguay consulate to save our grandparents, Martka Rosemarin. They were killed in Auschwitz, August 1943. And what you see on the right on the screen is a letter among the letters that I found in Masuwa, a letter written in May 1943 by this woman's grandfather, Mordechai Rosemarin, to Alfred Schwarzbaum, enclosing the photographs and asking that he send documents. And what you see typewritten on this grid paper is a page from Abraham Zilberstein's journal. He kept a journal of all the people for whom passports were being funneled, the requests. So this, for example, is request number 1481. And he typed in Mordechai Rosemarin's name with Mr. Rosemarin's birth date of 1878, Bensburg, which was the German name for Benjamin, his wife, Perla, the 4 children, which includes this young lady's father. Then you see on the bottom, it says pass number or passport number 324. And the date, December 27, 1942. If you look closely on the top right-hand side of the passport, just below the handwriting of Basha, her name, you see the number 324. And question, he's writing in 43 for the passport. Why, if you look at the passport, is it dated 1942? Answer, all these passports were backdated. They were backdated so the German authorities would not have any suspicion that this is some operation that was going on today. And in fact, you see on this grid, the dates of May 14, 43 is when the passport was ordered, and May 25, 43, when the passport was sent. Now, this you see is a letter dated April 27, 1943. This is a letter from Abraham Zilberstein addressed to Konstanty Rokitsky at the office of the Consul General Republic of Poland in Bern, enclosing photographs and personal information regarding 10 Jews in the Benjamin and Sosnowiec ghettos for purposes of obtaining documents. They didn't use the term passports. A couple of years ago, I organized a large group tour of Benjamin and the surrounding areas, and we had the pleasure of having a number of survivors come to the event in Poland. And one of the survivors, a man who I'd never met, I didn't even know he was a survivor, was this gentleman with the white hair. And I came over to him and I introduced myself, and he told me he was born in Benjamin. And I said, really? He didn't look that old to be really a survivor. And I asked him, when were you born? And he said, 1937. Well, 1937, he was 2 years old when the war began, and 5 years old when the ghetto was liquidated. So I asked him, how did you survive? And he looked up at me and he said, well, my uncle obtained a Honduran passport for my aunt and myself. And I asked him, who was your uncle? And he said, Alfred Schwarzbaum. I couldn't believe it. And he told me the story that he remembers vividly that his aunt got this passport, showed it to the German authorities in the ghetto, and they were arrested. They were sent on a train with other Jews from Benjamin, and they wound up in a POW camp in Tittmann in Germany, where it was called Liebenau in Bavaria, and that is how he survived. And I want to show you other survivors. On the top left hand, you see the gentleman in the middle is Michael Kalman. He was born in Amsterdam. He and his parents, he was born in Amsterdam in 1941. As a baby, he and his parents survived thanks to this passport. On the bottom, you see a cover of Tuti's Promise, a book that I highly recommend everyone purchase, written by my dear friend Heidi Fishman, about her mother, Ruth Lichtenstern, who was born in 1935 in Cologne, who survived with her parents. The gentleman in the middle is sort of partially responsible for the whole story coming to light because he was born in 1940. His name is Uri Strauss. He was born in 1940. He lives in Switzerland. He survived through the passport, which he's holding, but he was always curious how did that passport come about? And his curiosity and his friendship with Marcus Blechner, the honorary Polish consul in Zurich, helped bring this story to our attention. On the top right-hand side, you see Jakub Komuch, the former Polish ambassador to Bern, Switzerland, in the middle. And he is standing with the daughter of Mordechai and Hadassah Ksheshevo from Benjamin. Her father survived thanks to the passport. And in this photo, you see the next 2-3 generations, her daughter and granddaughter, her son rather, and granddaughter. And finally, on the bottom, in the center, by the way, to the left, in the center, you see the man with a beard. To the left of the man with the beard is the grandnephew of Alexander Ładoś, who happens to be a judge today in Poland. And to the right is the president of Poland, Andrzej Duda. And the man in the center, his father, Alexander Dinkel, survived because he received a Paraguayan passport in Germany. And Mr. Dinkel actually had that passport, which he inherited from his father. Continuing on, we have the lady in the center at the top left, Haneli Goslar, who was born in 1928 in Amsterdam. She was a very close friend of Anna Frank. And to her right is the Polish ambassador to Israel. On the bottom, you see again the president of Poland, Andrzej Duda, and a man with a hat and a goatee or beard. His name is Samuel Poltov. He was born in 1942 in Amsterdam. He and his parents were in the Westerbroek internment camp in Holland, about to be sent to Auschwitz or Sobibor when his father obtained a passport and they avoided deportation and ultimate death. On the top right-hand side, you see Lonnie Lesser. She was born in 1938 in Amsterdam. Her parents obtained a passport and her name was included on that passport, but she did not survive because of the passport. Her parents, who did survive through the passport, actually gave Lonnie to a Dutch couple who saved her during the war. And finally, on the bottom, you see next to, again, Ambassador Komuch, you see Marion Hess-Levin, who was born in 1938 in Amsterdam. She and her parents were sent to Bergen-Belsen instead of being sent to Auschwitz or Sobibor, and that is how they survived. So what are we to learn from this amazing story of a wonderful partnership between Poles and Jews, between Christians and Jews during wartime Europe? I think it only can be summed up with a saying in the Talmud, the Jewish Talmud, which is, he who saves one life, it is as if he saves a whole world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff and Sharon, for sharing these important stories with our patrons. We are at the end of our program time, so we don't have any time for questions, but Sharon has generously included her email in the chat box. So if you have any questions, she will be happy to respond to those via email. Sharon and Jeff, thank you so much. And I just want to note, we are repeating this same program tomorrow, which will be live at 7 p.m. Central Time. So if you want to attend, or if you found this to be as important and fascinating as I did, please tell anyone who you might think is potentially interested to join us tomorrow. Thank you all so much. This concludes the program, so we will be turning our cameras off at this time, but I will leave the program going for a few minutes in case anybody wants to check out any of the links that we provided in the chat box and fill out that virtual sign-in sheet. So thank you, Sharon and Jeff, and everyone who attended from near and afar, and we will see everyone tomorrow. Bye.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm going to put a note in the chat box. Will people see it?
Yes, people should see it.
Okay, thanks.